Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back to our very final session of Inclusive Design 2021, or indeed welcome if it's your first session of Inclusive Design 2021. I would just like to open this by saying a huge thanks to all of you who've been tuning in over the last 24 hours. Thank you for your questions, your tweets, your comments. They've really kept us going, and thank you to the speakers as well. Also, a huge thanks to our partners, Platinum supporters, Intopia, Fable, TPGI Arc, Adobe, and Gold supporter Tetralogical. If you haven't already, you can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf. That's ID24CONF. And if you have questions for our last presenter, then please do tweet them using the ID24 hashtag, and we will ask them at the end of the session. I have to say I'm very much looking forward to our last talk, and I can't think of a better person to bring ID24 to a close. So with that, I'll hand over to our guest host, Sarah Higley, who will give our next presenter the proper introduction he deserves. Sarah, over to you.
It's a lot of weight because this is a really exciting presentation. Coming up next is Jared Smith, talking about using the WebAIM Million and user surveys to inform your inclusion efforts. I'm really excited to hear what you say, Jared.
Very good. Thank you so much. And I'll just express my appreciation also to those that have been participating and to our wonderful hosts for all the work that they've been exerting over the last 24 hours. And I'm happy to be participating today and appreciate the invitation. I'm going to be talking about WebAIM research that we've conducted and how that might be helpful to you in your inclusion and accessibility efforts. I'm Jared Smith. I'm the Associate Director of WebAIM. WebAIM is the Web Accessibility in Mind project. We're based at the Institute for Disability Research, Policy, and Practice at Utah State University. And we do a lot of accessibility things. You can check us out on our website at webaim.org. But today I'm going to be talking about research and about accessibility data. And I think we can all probably agree that there's a shortage of good and readily available web accessibility data. There certainly is research that's happening and has been conducted. Most of the really good studies tend to be published behind paywalls, or they're very academic and maybe not approachable, or maybe just don't get the maybe a broad audience. To the folks that really could maybe best utilize that accessibility data. I've heard it said before that if we have data, let's look at data, and if all we have is opinion, then let's go with mine, right? And there's no shortage of opinions in the web accessibility field. We all are, I think, well-informed, we're well-intentioned, but sometimes we make decisions maybe based a lot on opinion and maybe less so on research and data, especially user-driven data. There's a Dilbert comic where Dilbert is presenting. He says, "I didn't have any accurate numbers, so I just made up this one." And he has a random dollar figure that he's presenting, and he says, "Studies have shown that accurate numbers aren't any more useful than the ones you make up." And the boss asks how many studies showed that, and Dilbert answers 87, right? We often don't know the answers to important accessibility questions. And sometimes that's okay, right? I think it's important that we acknowledge when there are questions to which we do not have answers, and that we recognize those gaps in our knowledge. But we also need to consider that we have things like requirements and accessibility guidelines that are there maybe based on kind of anecdotal data or experiences, and maybe not really solid research or quantitative types of data that could be maybe very informative to those. At WebAIM, we would and probably still do say things that we maybe don't know the answer for sure to those statements or questions. And we'd say things like, screen reader users prefer this, or they do this, or oh yeah, that's one of the most common accessibility issues out there on the web. We'd make statements like that without maybe actually knowing how accurate those were. So those are the things that have driven some of the research that we have conducted at WebAIM. I want to start talking about the WebAIM Million. So the WebA Million is an accessibility analysis of the home pages for the top 1 million websites. This is an analysis that we've conducted 3 times in February of 2019, 2020, and February of this year. Now, I have, on the slide, the word top homepages in quote there. This is not a study to determine which pages are most popular, right? We used a variety of sources based on network traffic or referrals, cross-linking, things like that. A few different sources to find 1 million really popular homepages, among the most popular that are out there, and conducted an accessibility testing. The data was collected using the Wave API. So the Wave API, it's fully rendering that web page inside of a browser. So we're getting the fully rendered DOM after JavaScript and CSS has been applied to it. So it's a much better representation of the end user experience encountering that data inside of a browser. We also detected if any of up to 1,200 different web technologies were in use on these particular pages. That would allow us to correspond accessibility data with the presence of certain web technologies. We also were able to categorize sites based on their content and function, and that data or metadata was provided by WebShrinker. It's a large database of site category data. So having done this for 3 years with a whole bunch of pieces of data, our database now has about 2 billion points of data in it. Now, sometimes people ask us, why just home pages? Well, one thing we know from research we've done is that homepage errors tend to correlate to errors found elsewhere within a site. So there is a correspondence between those. The homepage is also the gateway to a website. It's often the first experience that people are going to encounter. And if the homepage has accessibility barriers, very often that is going to reflect the accessibility of the rest of the site and certainly that end user experience. We did do an analysis last year of 100,000 interior pages on some of the most popular sites. So we went deeper into the sites, and we found that really there wasn't a whole lot of difference between the types of things we were seeing on home pages versus those interior pages. And there was a correlation or correspondence between the types and numbers of errors that we're seeing between home pages and other pages on that same website. So as a summary of our 2021 WebA Million analysis, across our million homepages, we detected 51,379,694 errors. So that's an average of about 51.4 detectable errors per homepage on average. What that means is that if you were a user with disability, on average, you would expect about 1 in every 17 homepage elements, links, buttons, images, things like that, to have a detectable accessibility error. Now, when we talk about errors, these are barriers, they're WCAG or Section 508 failures that we can detect with a high level of reliability. We understand it's an automated process, it's not perfect, but these are things that are generally readily detectable and align with WCAG failures. And we found that 97.4% of those million homepages had detectable WCAG2 failures. Now, because we're only looking at automatically detectable errors, which are a smallish portion of overall possible WCAG failures, we know that the actual WCAG conformance rate is low, very low. Probably, I think well under 1% is probably a pretty safe statement for overall WCAG conformance for home pages. Now, the WCAG conformance was down, the failure rate for WCAG of WCAG was down slightly from 2020, just a slight improvement in this year's analysis. The number of detectable errors on average over our 3 years has gone down a little bit. 2019 and 2020, it was right about 60 errors per homepage. In 2021, it was down to 50, just over 51. So that was, I think, a notable improvement as far as the number of errors. So hopefully that trajectory and path will continue into the future. On the other hand, we have also seen a significant increase in the number of homepage elements. So those are divs, spans, images, buttons, links, things like that are detected on a homepage. We count those when we do our analysis. This year, on average, there were 887 elements on the average homepage, 887. And we've seen that number just really increase over the last few years. I think that if we consider that complexity and just the busyness of a page has an impact on accessibility, I think that's a notable increase that maybe we should be certainly aware of and maybe even concerned about, as homepages are just getting heavier and busier and larger. If we look at the types of errors that we detected, 86% of these 1 million homepages had at least one instance of low contrast text. 61% had images missing alternative text. 54% had inputs that were missing labels. 51% had empty links. 29% did not have the document language identified. And 27% had empty buttons. Now, empty links and buttons, those are going to be links or buttons that do not contain text or have any other type of associated description or text that would identify what the functionality of those links or buttons are. Now, if we look at these most common errors, these are really like accessibility 101 type of things, right? They're all readily detectable. We could do that with an automated tool. And most of these are pretty easy to fix. At least they're not super complicated, from a technical standpoint, from a code standpoint, to actually address these. Some are as easy as adding, one single attribute. In fact, almost all of these are one single attribute that can be added, a little bit of code, maybe a slight change to some styles to address these issues across the site. One thing that these data tell us is that focusing only on these few types, just these 6 types of errors, would have a significant impact on accessibility across the web. Right? We tend to spend a lot of time, focusing on like web components and ARIA widgets and complex scripting and things like that. And those are important, they're impactful, but really they represent a pretty small portion of accessibility issues by number across the web. But they tend to take probably the majority of our bandwidth and effort in accessibility conversations and discussions. So maybe taking a step back to the basics, to the things that at WebAIM, we've been talking about these things for 20 years, addressing those, it will certainly have a big impact on the end user experience. As we look at these common errors over time, we've seen increases in the number of homepages with low contrast text, missing input labels, and empty buttons. We've seen slight decreases over time of homepages that have images that are missing alternative text, empty links, and missing document language. So some of these are kind of getting higher. Some of them are decreasing a little bit over time. If we dig in a little bit deeper into some of the details for low contrast text, on average, the average homepage has 31 instances of low contrast text. 31 on average. That's a lot of text on the average homepage that is going to be have contrast that is below the WCAG contrast requirements. We account for things like large text, and we're applying those WCAG calculations to our analysis. Over 1/3 of images that were detected had missing, questionable, or redundant alternative text. And half of the images that did not have alternative text were linked images. So meaning the only thing inside of a link. So not only is it an alternative text issue, but it's also a functional issue, which is now you have a link that does not have any descriptive text as to what the function of that link is. So more impactful than just an alternative text error. 45%, almost half, of the 4.4 million form inputs that were detected on these million homepages were not properly labeled. And when we talk about labels, we're looking at the label element, the title attribute, ARIA label, ARIA labeled by, kind of any of the things that might help these inputs to be accessible. Almost half of them were lacking that basic accessibility. If we dive a little deeper into ARIA, Accessible Rich Internet Applications markup, 68% of homepages had some ARIA defined. That excludes landmark roles. And that's a number that we've seen increase over time. So ARIA is becoming more prevalent. And you might ask, well, is that good for accessibility or not? The fact that we're seeing accessibility techniques implemented more broadly generally sounds like a good thing. We do also need to consider, rule number 1 of ARIA that we talked about, which is, don't use ARIA unless you really need to. And I think we're sometimes seeing ARIA implemented in ways that actually are maybe not beneficial for accessibility. On average, these homepages had 48 ARIA attributes. So again, rule number 1, that's an awful lot of ARIA on the average homepage, 48 instances of ARIA attributes. 69% of pages had at least one region or landmark. Only 30% had a main region or a main landmark. So is that good or bad? 30% is more than 0. That's what it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So that's an improvement. It also means 70% of pages did not have that real critical main content region or landmark defined. We look at the number of certain types of ARIA markup. On average, there were 7.6 ARIA label or ARIA labeled by attributes per page. And that's a pretty big increase from 5.6 per page in 2020. There were 8.9 ARIA hidden attributes, up from 6.6 just over a year ago. There were 2.2 on average elements with role equals button. That's up almost 50% from 2020. So again, we're seeing a lot more ARIA implemented on these homepages, which can be good. It can also be bad if it's not done correctly. And what we found is the pages that did have ARIA present averaged 24 more detectable errors than pages without ARIA. In other words, ARIA was one of the most strongly corresponding things that we could correspond with accessibility errors. In other words, if ARIA is present, almost always there was going to be more other types of detectable errors on that page. And if there was more ARIA markup, there were more detectable errors. Now, that's maybe not entirely unexpected. These pages with ARIA were significantly more complex. On average, pages with ARIA had well over 1,000 elements, links, spans, divs, things like that. So they're more complex. You thus might anticipate or even expect more accessibility issues to come with that. Now, the intent of the ARIA is to address those accessibility issues, but we find that there actually is not that correspondence. If there's more ARIA, there are more detectable errors. For instance, 60% of ARIA menus, role equals menu, did not have proper coding markup in them. So over half of these menus that were included ARIA, probably with the intention to improve accessibility, were not actually coded properly. So it kind of brings up that question of, is ARIA really improving accessibility or not? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if the data answer that question for us. So there are, really some interesting things, some good things that come from these data, but also some concerns in the ARIA usage and how they tend to correspond with accessibility issues. And a couple other little, nuggets of data. 22% of pages had links with ambiguous text, things like click here, more, or continue. And when those kinds of links were present, they averaged 5.9 ambiguous links on average. So, if there was one ambiguous link, chances are there were going to be several others on that particular page. 10% of pages had a skip link, a skip to main content or skip navigation link, but 11% of those were broken, meaning that they didn't actually function properly. 11% of homepages had no headings at all. And 38% of homepages had skipped heading levels, so a document structure that maybe was not properly structured. One thing that was interesting is we found that pages that had a valid HTML5 doc type had nearly twice as many elements and 35% more errors than other pages. Now, a page with an HTML5 doc type would generally probably indicate that the page is newer, kind of a little more recent, but it was also way heavier, right? Almost twice as many elements and a whole lot more errors than other pages. If we look at categories of websites, this is a little bit of a complicated chart, I'll describe it. But if we look at types or categories of these homepages and look at the numbers of errors compared to the average homepage, shopping websites, for instance, had 46% more errors on average than the average homepage. News or weather pages had 43%. Travel websites had 16% more errors. Now, education websites had just slightly, like 1% fewer accessibility errors than the average homepage. So they were pretty much on par or average with all of the rest of the homepages. Health pages had 6% fewer. Government pages had 9% fewer errors on average. So some pretty significant disparities in the numbers of errors that we were seeing based on the content or the nature of the content or category of that particular homepage. We looked at document language. There were even more significant differences in this. I think this is really insightful and can maybe help drive some efforts, because we see really big differences based on the document language that is specified. For instance, Russian pages had 60% more errors than the average homepage. Chinese pages, 55% more. Spanish pages, 30% more. French pages, 17% more. German, 10% more. Japanese, 3% more. We don't start to see an improvement over the average until we get to some other languages. Dutch had 2% less, and then English, which represented the majority of these homepages, was 8% fewer errors than the average. Interestingly, web pages where there was not a document specified at all, which was a WCAG failure automatically and detected as a WCAG failure, those pages were among the most accessible of all. And I don't know exactly what that means, but it is kind of interesting. Again, maybe that suggests older pages that have not introduced document language tend to have fewer errors. We also did analysis of top-level domains, .com, .org, things like that, and then our online report has more insight into those. We did find that .gov web pages were among the best, but that's still 27 errors on average on the average .gov homepage. So quite a few errors out there, even among the very best categories. We also looked at a lot of different types of technologies, and this chart just shows a few of the technologies and kind of differences in accessibility errors when those technologies are present. For instance, Google Ads. If a web page had at least one Google ad, on average, it had 27 more errors, 53% more than average than the average homepage. So interestingly, the Google Ads themselves did not introduce detectable accessibility errors. But there's a really strong correspondence between pages that have any type of ad, Google ad or otherwise, and a quite notable increase in detectable errors. Web pages with the Vue.js framework had 31% more errors. Slick, which is probably the most common carousel script, which are very common on home pages, those had 24% more detectable errors than the average page. jQuery, which is very pervasive, it was detected on 62% of the home pages. It corresponded with an increase of 20% more errors. Bootstrap, 15% more. Modernizer, 13% more. WordPress, again, which is very ubiquitous across the web, 10% more. So pages with WordPress had more errors than pages that did not utilize WordPress. Now, there were a few technologies, very few actually, that corresponded with fewer detectable errors. Drupal had 1% fewer. React had 2% fewer. Now, one thing that's interesting about React is that it saw real notable improvements from 2020 to 2021. In fact, it went from 64 detectable errors on average to 50 errors. So there were some real significant outreach efforts to the React community. And I'm not saying React is the perfect solution for accessibility, but there really were some significant efforts to address accessibility. Okay, I'm back. I'm not sure
Okay,
exactly
yeah.
what happened there.
You're back. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm just gonna pick up where I left off here. I'm not sure where that was. Give me just a moment. I'll get set back up here. Apologize for the technical issue there.
Take your time, not a problem.
Okay. All right, you should hopefully be seeing the slide again there. So, okay, wonderful. All right, so what I was saying is that we have to be careful that correlation is not causation, right? We can't, from the data that we have, know that, for instance, these technologies are introducing or causing more detectable accessibility errors, or maybe a less accessible end user experience, at least from the data that we have itself. But there are strong correspondences between the presence of technologies and these detectable errors that I think is informative. But we need to be careful about, spurious correlations, right? For instance, I found that NVDA usage, as reported as, the percentage of screen reader users that report using NVDA, correlates very strongly with exports from Pakistan over the last 10 years, which is incredible, right? So if we want to either increase NVDA usage, we just need to increase exports from Pakistan because they tend to correlate, right? That's not right. That's causation and not just correlation. We need to be really careful about using these data to suggest that maybe certain things are causing accessibility errors. However, we found in our data that nearly all of the technologies that we looked for, if there was some sort of technology thing, Google Ads or Maps or JavaScript frameworks or libraries or content management systems, nearly all of those accessibility for good. For instance, what if jQuery or WordPress, they're very common technologies, what if they enforced accessibility, right? What if they what if they were doing things that just really kind of required better accessibility? What would that impact be on people with disabilities if these really, really common technologies were improving accessibility and not just being the status quo? Okay, hopefully I'm still with you. I want to talk for just a minute. Now I'm going to skip this one. It's just kind of talking about error density. It's just kind of a concern that we have about using density of errors, like how many number of detectable errors divided by number of page elements as a metric for measuring accessibility. The problem that we're seeing is that the complexity of pages, the number of elements, are significantly increasing faster than the number of detectable errors. So if you use error density as a metric for accessibility, it tends to be easier to improve your error density scoring by making your page more complex, adding elements, right? Add elements, your score gets better. And that maybe is not actually improving accessibility. We do have a full report available on the WebAIM site where we go into a lot of the detail on these data and a whole lot more. We also have a lookup function where you can type in any of the homepage domains for those million pages, and you can see how they kind of are ranked in our million page analysis. Okay, so hopefully those data can be helpful. I think it's important to know, what's happening. Where are we at on the web when it comes to accessibility, and what are those common issues? But also important is that we're engaging more with the users, that we're getting user data. And so WebAIM has done several surveys. We've done 9 screen reader user surveys. We conduct those about every 18 months or so. We've done 2 surveys of users with low vision, 3 surveys of web accessibility practitioners. That's folks like you that are implementing accessibility. And we did a survey of users with motor disabilities. We have all of the write-ups freely available on the WebAIM site. So I wanted to talk about a few of the things that, that we have found in our data that might be helpful in your inclusion efforts. One is, we asked respondents to, for instance, our screen reader user survey as to whether they use a screen reader due to a disability, and 7.7% indicate that they do not. Now, some people are maybe alarmed by that. Why are we asking questions, screen reader questions from screen reader users that don't have a disability? Well, it's primarily to see if there are differences, right? Do respondents with disabilities, are their responses different from those, with or without disabilities? Are there differences there? That's really what we look at. For the most part, there are not very significant differences between these two audiences. They're, the technologies they use, the things, their preferences and responses tend to generally correspond. We do highlight in our reports anytime there are any notable discrepancies between those two audiences. One of the important questions that we ask in all of our surveys is about their feelings regarding the accessibility of web content over the previous year, whether they feel things have become more accessible, less accessible, or no change over the previous year. In our last screen reader user survey, 39% indicated that things became more accessible, compared to 19% that said it became less accessible. So if anything, hopefully this can help motivate you in the work that you're doing, right? You're making a difference. And I know it may not seem like enough. It might seem really slow. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've banged my head against the wall an awful lot with the progress that we're making. But know that when we ask users with disabilities, they indicate that things are getting better. Not all of them, but more of them indicate that things are getting better than worse. So keep your chins up, keep at it. You're making a difference. One of the primary motivations for our screen reader user survey is to find out what technologies respondents are using. In our last survey, about 54% of respondents indicated using JAWS as their primary desktop or laptop screen reader, 31% NVDA, about 7% VoiceOver, and then other screen readers were about 9%. Of interest, Narrator for Windows was about 0.5%, less than 1%, indicated as a primary desktop laptop screen reader. We also asked about all screen readers that were used, and Narrator tends to be used a fair amount, just not very often as a primary screen reader. So knowing what are the most common screen readers, I think, can be insightful into our testing efforts. We have seen changes in this over time. JAWS had seen a steady decline for about the last, over 10 years. And then in our last survey this year, saw a fairly notable increase in responses as being the primary screen reader. And then both NVDA and VoiceOver that had seen slow increases over time saw decreases in our most recent survey. Now, always when we talk about these things, people say, well, why are we seeing these changes? Why, especially here where we're seeing a change in trajectory of responses to desktop and laptop primary screen reader usage? Well, I always say data are what data are, right? We just report the data. Now, this is an open survey to all screen reader users. We do not, control the sample. So we cannot say that our survey data is representative of all screen reader users, but it is representative of the several thousand screen reader users that take our survey and respond. And that's an awful lot of users. I think it is informative. At least it's representative of maybe connected screen reader users that are likely to take an online survey from WebAIM. And if that provides some insight, hopefully that's helpful. But we need to be a little cautious, knowing that the demographics, the number, the types of people that are maybe getting the survey from year to year probably are changing a little bit, but it is a fairly wide audience that is responding. If we look a little bit more at that screen reader question, we see some interesting differences between those that reported having disabilities versus those without disabilities. For instance, JAWS usage this year was 56% among those with disabilities and only 29% among those without disabilities. If we look at VoiceOver was used by 6% of respondents that had a disability, but 19% of those without a disability. So pretty notable difference. If we look at our practitioner user survey, so that's not just screen reader users, that's people that are implementing accessibility, almost 35% of them indicated using VoiceOver as their primary testing platform. So what this means is we have almost 6 times higher usage of voiceover usage among web accessibility practitioners than among screen reader users with disabilities. That's a pretty significant difference, right? I think that's something that we need to be mindful of. If we're only using voiceover in our testing, that likely is not going to be corresponding with the screen reader usage of probably our actual audience of users of screen readers. So we need to consider our own testing practices. Are those things in alignment with our users? We can get data about screen reader and browser combinations. We have a full data table and chart of this on the WebAIM site, so you can look at those. Just know that there are a lot of different technologies that are in use out there. We don't have to test all of them, but we do need to consider that our users are very different. They're not just using a couple of combinations here. There were actually hundreds of different browser screen reader combinations reported in our survey. Of course, some of those are used more than others. So we can ask our own users, ask them what they're using. That can be really insightful and help drive our own testing efforts. So what do we start to do with this? This cartoon has Boss Man saying, let's solve this problem by using the big data. None of us have the slightest idea what to do with. That's kind of how I feel. I've got these billions of data points, and some of it's really interesting, but what do we start to do with it? Especially when we know it is incomplete data, right? They say there are 2 kinds of people in the world. First, those that can extrapolate from incomplete data. That's the whole joke, right? So we need to we need to be examining our own data. There's so much more that can be done out there to help inform our field about what is happening, especially user data. And with that focus of that data being on users with disabilities. So as we look to the future and some things that might be helpful for us, we're going to continue doing this research. We're going to do the WebAIM million, maybe more than 1 million in the future analysis every year. We're going to continue to conduct our regular surveys and share that widely and freely, just to help us get track changes over time and get new insights into what's happening out there. Maybe we can define metrics for weighting specific types of errors to better determine what the user impact of these accessibility issues might be. There's some interesting challenges with that. Are missing captions more impactful than missing alt text? We're talking about totally different audiences. Starts to get a little tricky. What about more data analytics? Just really diving into these data to see if there's meaning in there that can be helpful. Maybe adding manual testing data to identify basically kind of automatic to manual correlations. For instance, if these types of automatically detectable issues are present, what other types of not automatically detectable issues might be present? And can we then use those data to help drive them? Or maybe vice versa. If we're detecting these types of manual issues, what is that telling us about that end user experience? So we're going deeper than just addressing the high level issues, but focusing on that user experience. We might use machine learning, artificial intelligence, to start get more and more useful data. Especially looking at the tools and technologies that are in use on the web and how those align with the end user experience. I think we need to look at where things are good. That's interestingly a little bit difficult when we talk about like machine learning, because we need good models. And there aren't a lot of good models for optimal accessibility on the web, right? If we're looking at the web very broadly, again, 98% of pages have detectable WCAG failures. So we need good and better models to help inform, how do we get from where we're at to where we want to be? Maybe, some processes to, kind of automatically identify and then fix some of these issues. So overall, I think that having data can help us improve what we're doing. I think it can help us transition, and this is what I would like to see in the future, is kind of a transition more from like what went wrong, what went right, to why did it occur, right? Instead of just looking at what's wrong, what is it that caused those particular issues to become present in the first place? If we find data that correlates certain types of accessibility errors to particular content management systems or web frameworks, then maybe we could have more targeted education, bug fixing activities, awareness activities. I think we saw that over the last year or so with React, right? didn't look very good in our first two WebAMillion analyses. And then there was an education and outreach effort, and the number of detectable errors decreased. So maybe those types of things can start to have a bigger impact of not just, casting blame, but looking at what are the causes for these and why are they there and how can we then address those. Maybe having things be less, maybe shifting from being descriptive to more prescriptive, right? Instead of describing what the issues are, prescribing solutions to those, and maybe prescribing things that can be done in an automated way, or at least streamlining that process for improved accessibility. And then more from detection to prevention, right? Having good models of change from inaccessible to accessible, finding out what those are, and then replicating those, duplicating those good efforts so that they can become more widespread. As my friends like to always say, and we say it too, shift left, right? How do we move this further left in that process so we're having a greater impact? So every time I talk about the stuff that we're doing, I always end with this question. So what are you going to do about it? Hopefully there's been something here that's been insightful, or something that's maybe motivated you to look at some data or look at your user experience or do something maybe a little bit better. Challenge all of us to go out and just do at least one thing, something to help improve the user experience. And, thank you for what you're doing. You're doing great work, and, keep it up.
It looks like we might have lost Jared again at that crucial point. I'm not sure if he can hear us, but hopefully he'll be back online any moment now. I don't know about you, but I thought that was a fantastic talk, full of data, full of information. I kind of almost immediately want to go back and go through that again. Ooh. Maybe he's going to rejoin. Hello, welcome back.
I'm back.
Oh. You just made it to
all this talk of technology, and it's getting me. But I know, hopefully you got most of what I said for the last 45 minutes.
No, we got it. It literally finished on the last slide, so that was good. I was just saying there's so much information in there to process, really good stuff, and I know that I'll be going back over that and having a think. And it also occurred to me as I was listening, I know that when I go through my daily work, I'll be doing what I've always done with the WebAIM surveys. I'll be working on something and I'll be like, oh yeah, there's some data that can back that up somewhere. I can go and get that. So yeah, that's great. Thank you. I do have a question, but I'm just gonna hand it over to Sarah and see if she's got any questions from the floor, so to speak.
I haven't seen anything on Twitter yet, so if you have any burning questions, please tweet #ID24. But Henny, go ahead, since you mentioned you had one.
Okay. It's a bit of a cheeky one, to be honest with you, Jared. So 86% of home pages have low text contrast, according to the data. That's a really hard one to acknowledge, but honestly, I'm not particularly surprised to hear that, because we know that contrast and branding, traditionally they don't rub along always particularly well together, and they can be difficult to reconcile. Now, the stats are there for us to take and use to build our business cases, but I looked at that and I thought I can think of a number of scenarios in previous roles where if the marketing or the branding manager had come across that stat, they would be like, it's our brand, number one. If 86% of other homepages are not doing it, then really I don't feel particularly motivated to do that. So in that kind of situation, how would you push back?
We may have lost him again.
Oh my goodness. Or maybe he's just sitting very still.
Thinking about it deeply.
It's a difficult one, because I think the color contrast issue and branding is often a real challenge, and for good reason. It's your corporate identity. yeah, I saw that stat and it made me think, gosh, that could be used against us.
Yeah, I do think there is a bit of a herd mentality risk where if you see how many other people like are doing poorly, then
Yeah,
yeah.
it could be that. Welcome back again.
Hi, I'm back. I don't know what's going on. So I think I got most of your question.
Okay.
It's about contrast, and that is a real challenge. Like I say, if everybody's broken, what's the problem with us being broken too? And it is an interesting challenge, and I think a lot of it stems from just a lack of understanding of the impact of low contrast text, especially across users with disabilities and the aging population. It's some interesting trends, I think, in design that are not user centric. Is a big one. Jeremy Keith, I think it was, published something in just the last week or so, and it actually talked about the types of accessibility issues and where they tend to have their root, where they stem from. And he talked about contrast as being one that is really a systemic issue, right? If you have contrast issues on your website, that it's not a coding thing, it's not a development thing, that is a systemic thing. It's reflective of an overall culture that's maybe not very inclusive, because from early in design through an entire design and development process, something that could pose an accessibility barrier was not only accepted but maybe forced. And it was just really insightful for me to maybe think a little bit about cultures of accessibility and inclusion, and how we maybe have strayed away from really a focus on that user experience, or maybe a focus more on the corporate branding and things like that at the expense of the user, and how it really is more systemic and maybe rooted in ableism as a real cause for some of that. And then, as we get into like coding things, there are problems there, but they tend to be less maybe systemic and maybe more a problem of education and training and good tools. So.
Right. And I think with things like code is a lot easier relative term. It's change that happens under the bonnet. It doesn't reflect design. It's harder to change design once it's out there. And I hadn't thought about it in the context of what Jeremy was saying, with it being a systemic issue and it being embedded in culture. And I think you're right, that is quite insightful. It is difficult to change design, and design is very much rooted in sense and feeling and emotion and sort of all of those different things. So yeah, that's really interesting. Any more? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, as a developer, I wouldn't let developers off the hook, because I think systemic ableism is like, you had the slide with frameworks, but I think even if you dug into like component libraries, things like that, like you can really see systemic ableism, the fact that like you can't go out and choose a component library or like a charting library or a grid or menu component without finding one that has lots of accessibility issues, because you just don't have choice. And I don't know, I think it's as much a part of the ecosystem in development as it is in design.
Yeah, I agree, but it doesn't have to be that way. I think we have models for tools that can be made, with accessibility at the get-go, that are still innovative and amazing, and serve real world purpose, but have that accessibility just baked right into them. And so it's not impossible, but it is a challenge, and it's an interesting challenge for us to all keep taking on.
Yeah, kind of to your point of like, it doesn't have to be this way. I had a question about some of the like changes, some of the trends between your first WebAIM Million through the current one. I'm super curious. Like you mentioned, you can't get why from the data. I am very curious about the why, and I was curious if you'd done any like manual explorations or like targeted manual explorations into like why some of those changes might have happened, or if you have any like sense of like why React bugs, sorry for the dog, went down or increased in other cases.
Yeah, not a lot. Again, we're talking about a pretty big chunk of the web, and so it's hard to get to maybe those some of those causation questions when you really are dealing with a very broad data set. That's an interesting challenge that we have, right? We can look at, React, for instance, as one small subset of that, and where we've seen some change there. But I think most of it comes down to education and awareness. I think this is becoming a bigger topic. Frankly, lawsuits and the increase in lawsuits, I think, just driving a lot of that for good or bad. So I think those are some of those why questions that we're seeing. But I think it's a little kind of too early to tell from the data itself, but we would love to have some help from folks that, to dive into this a little bit more and help us with some of those questions. We're doing some work right now to do some more high-level manual testing and correlate that with the automatic data. So we get maybe a richer pieces of data that can help drive some of those kinds of things, not just looking at the data, but looking at end user impact and then seeing how patterns and numbers in the data correspond with actual end user impact and see how they can inform one another. It's kind of interesting work that we're trying to tackle, but we would love to have some help with that.
It's huge and really valuable. So for anybody out there who's interested in helping, then get in touch with Jared. And yeah, I'm really interested. It takes me back to my days of working at Opera, where we had a software called Mama that trawled through the internet, and from that I was able to pull out some data about how many websites didn't have an H1 or had no headings at all, and that was really interesting.
Yeah. Mama was a big driving thing. I remember getting really useful data from that, and it went away a long time ago, but that was one of the driving factors for us to do the Web A-Million, is to make open and available those types of information. So
brilliant.
Really quick, if somebody did want to help out or follow along with what you're doing, how would you recommend they do so?
Yeah, you can reach out to me on the webaim.org site. We're happy to share our data. We'd love to have insight and contributions to our survey. We'd like to get the survey out, of course, to a much broader audience. So there's ways that people can help with that too.
Absolutely. And I think the global audience is really, really important. I think we're very kind of Western centric in how we approach sort of not just accessibility, but web design overall. So as many global voices as possible would be great.
Yeah, I think the Web A-Million, when we look at language and top level domain, it does indicate some pretty significant differences and different patterns and different technologies that, I'm not sure how to even start to address some of those with an international audience, but it's clear that maybe our Western model is not working elsewhere. So
right, absolutely. And why should it?
Yep.
Really? So fantastic. Thank you so much, Jared. That was a really great talk, and thank you very much, Sarah, as well. Finally, if you like the session, hit the YouTube button, and don't forget to subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 to be kept in the loop of all future events. It's all going to be in the future now. Inclusive Design is brought to you with huge thanks to our supporters: Intopia, Fable, TPG Arc, Adobe, Tetralogical, Intuit, Infoaxia, Centre of Inclusive Design, Web Directions, AAA, Adrian Roselli, LLC, and Can Access. We will be back at the top of the hour at 1 o'clock, well, 1 o'clock my time, but in 6 minutes, to wrap up this year's Inclusive Design with an after party where the team behind the green curtain have been busy pulling together lots of interesting stats about what's been happening over the last 24 hours. So please do join us. And thank you once again to all of our speakers, all of our hosts, and all of you who've tuned in and supported us.